Okay, let's get started. Thank you for attending today's webinar regarding the changes to the city's STEP manual. For those of you who may not know, STEP stands for Streetscape and Transportation Program and covers the policies for the installation of traffic calming devices in the neighborhoods. My name is Laura Kaifas and I'm with the Tempe Neighborhood Services Office. I'll be helping out with hosting today's meeting. Our presenters today will be Kathy Hollow, traffic engineer for the city of Tempe, and Randy Dittburner with Lee Engineering, the consultant the city has contracted to help us with revising our current process. Today's meeting is being recorded and will be posted to the website tempe.gov/step in about a day or so. Before we get started, some information on how to participate. After the presentation, we'll have a question and answer period. You can either type your question in the chat or the Q&A section. I will read them for the team to answer, or you can raise your hand and I will unmute you so you can ask the question yourself. If your question is related to a specific slide, you may want to jot that down to help facilitate the discussion. To raise your hand, find your name on the participant list and hover over it. The hand icon will appear. Click on that. This will put the icon by your name. You can click it off once your question has been answered. If you're on your cell phone, please click on the chat bubble. If there are many raised hands, I will call on the participants in the order received. Please note that the comments from today's meeting will not be logged in as official comments. To register an official comment, please visit tempe.gov/forum after our webinar and click the link for the survey. For more information or to view documents related to this project, please visit tempe.gov/step. A link to the recording of this meeting will be posted there. The comment period for this topic is open from now until July 12th. Okay, I think that covers it. Kathy, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So good morning. I am Kathy Hollow. I am the city traffic engineer, as Laura said, and I want to thank you all for being here this morning for the presentation on the city's STEP manual update. We are here to present the project progress and take any comments that you all may have. So I'd like to give you a little background on the STEP program. The city previously had a neighborhood traffic mitigation program to address neighborhood traffic concerns. And that was like the 90s, early 2000s. In the late 2000s, the city decided to expand the program and formalize the process. As a result, the city developed the STEP manual, which was finalized in 2008. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the manual, but the manual covers 3 basic content areas. First, it describes traffic concerns that may be addressed using the STEP process. Second, it provides a toolbox of solutions that may be implemented in the city right-of-way. And then third, it outlines the process for reviewing concerns, collecting data, developing alternatives, and gaining consensus. And it is this content area that we are looking to update. Also, just want to make a note that for the most part, right now, speed cushions are what are requested for traffic calming. And while that has a defined process, this is not even currently included in the manual. So this will become part of the update as well. So last September 2020, staff presented information on the existing manual to the Transportation Commission and to City Council. Questions raised at these meetings and resident comments that we have received indicated that now was the time to update the manual. As Laura said, the city hired a local traffic engineering consulting firm, Lee Engineering, to lead the update. And with that, I will turn it over to Randy Dittburner to discuss what they have found and where we are in the process. Randy?
Good morning. Thank you, Kathy, and thanks to everybody for being here today. We are delighted as Lee Engineering to be involved with the opportunity to update the STEP manual. And I want to just kind of talk through our progress so far and let you know where we stand, and we'll be anxious to get your comments and questions as we go today as well. So hopefully you can see my screen. Kathy talked about the STEP manual being updated back in 2008, looking to help to improve traffic conditions inside neighborhoods. And just very briefly talks about the process to prioritize projects for implementation. The STEP manual really does emphasize participation by residents. and it presents the criteria for how neighborhoods can gain consensus on traffic calming devices in their neighborhoods. Several different problems, traffic problems, are addressed by the manual: speeding, high traffic volume, pedestrian and bicycle safety, unwanted traffic, some may call cut-through traffic, problems with sight distance, law violations other than speeding, like stop sign running, that sort of thing, are all purported to be addressed by the STEP manual as well. So Kathy talked about the three components of the manual, and the process is really the one that we're spending our energy on as part of this update. And the process, we've kind of broken it down into these 6 areas. This is a kind of a summary. It certainly is more complicated than this, but just by way of framing it, the process starts when stakeholders submit a request. City staff review the request and make a response. And then there's this question about, is there a problem? Do traffic conditions justify some action? And then the neighborhood really, in step 4, has to make a decision about whether to proceed with a traffic mitigation plan. And that could be either a small scale plan or a large scale plan. And there are a little bit different practices in the manual for both of those. If so, the city will designate a petition boundary, and then residents proceed to go through the process of consensus building, collecting signatures on a petition to support whatever traffic calming plan is being pursued. So in our scope, we are looking at traffic calming practices of other agencies to see how Tempe compares with other cities, not only cities in the valley, but also cities elsewhere in the country that have demographics similar to Tempe, particularly those with a large major university and kind of a more suburban feel. We're looking at potential process improvements, and we'll talk about some of those today. The effort also included the formation of a stakeholder advisory committee. That committee met several times earlier in the spring, and it was very helpful for us to learn from residents, city staff, and other stakeholders on what has worked well with the STEP program and what some challenges are. After we get comments from the public on some potential changes that we'll talk about today, we'll be formalizing the changes into a draft manual, which will be also open for comment, and then we'll be finalizing that into a new manual for eventual publication. So I talked about the Stakeholder Advisory Committee, and I just want to highlight some of the challenges that we heard from that committee during the course of our meetings earlier in the spring. And these challenges really were the ones that kind of led us to look for ways that we could improve the process to help address. The first one is, a key component of the STEP program, as I said earlier, is this petitioning process, where residents are walking around, likely knocking on doors and trying to drum up support for the traffic calming program. And the first challenge that we heard is that some owners don't respond. They either don't answer the door, or they don't they don't sign the petition. And according to the current STEP program, if someone doesn't respond, those parcels are presumed to be opposed to the program. And so that's probably a good strategy, because you want to make sure that you have good, solid neighborhood-wide support for a traffic mitigation plan. But when someone is not responding, it makes it very difficult to pursue a traffic calming plan. And that's particularly true in the second bullet for parcels that are immediately adjacent to a proposed traffic calming device. The STEP program requires that all parcels adjacent to a device must be in support in order for the plan to proceed. So if one of those parcels doesn't respond to a petitioner, it really does jeopardize the whole plan. I think in general, the city is wise to require support from the adjacent parcels, but the STEP program is not intended to be derailed by someone who doesn't respond. I think it's appropriate for someone who doesn't support a device to not have one forced in front of their house. But for someone who doesn't respond, that's a very difficult situation to address for petitioners. Third bullet is we heard that it's difficult to reach residents in gated communities in particular. Gated communities usually have private streets, but they may be within the petition boundary for a traffic calming device on a public street because they may be impacted by it. And so if the conventional petition gathering method is just knocking on doors, it's very difficult to reach folks in a gated community. Multifamily neighborhoods with facilities like townhouses and apartment complex and condos are also very difficult for petitioners because there are lots and lots of doors, and a lot of those folks are rentals and may not be aware of or as tuned in to some of the traffic issues in the neighborhood. And then I think just last on the page here, signature gathering is a high bar for neighborhoods to overcome. It's a really essential part of the project to make sure that there is strong support within the community. But boy, it's a difficult process. So we wanted to try to come up with some ways to improve the consensus building process. So I'm going to talk about some of the changes that we are thinking about. We've talked about these potential changes with the stakeholder group that I mentioned, and we've shared these with city staff, but are also very interested to get comments from the public as well. So if you have questions or comments about these changes, by all means, we're very interested. And I guess I will also just say that these are summaries, so we're trying to make them fit on slides, and so in some cases they're abbreviated a bit, but we're trying to give you the main points of most of these major changes. So I think the first thing we'll talk about is the title of the document. Linda, at the beginning of the presentation, translated the acronym STEP as Streetscape and Transportation Enhancement Program. We're not sure that that acronym is super obvious, and we think it might make more sense to call it a neighborhood traffic calming guide to make its contents a little more clear. I think one of the other things we heard from the stakeholder group is that there are a lot of folks in Tempe, even folks that are interested in traffic calming, who might not be familiar with the STEP manual or might not even be aware that the STEP manual exists. So we hope that by making the title a little more intuitive, it might help with the marketing of that document a little bit. The existing STEP manual has 3 request forms: a stakeholder action request form, a stakeholder support form, and a stakeholder request form. They're all somewhat similar, and I think the goal of those forms is to solicit input from a group of residents to make sure that there is more than just one person who's interested in kind of pursuing a traffic calming request. And our proposal is to consolidate those 3 forms into a single form, which we would call a neighborhood traffic request, that would, I guess, simplify the request process a little bit. Rather than having 3 forms and having folks wonder which one might be the right one, we would propose to just have the single form and then allow folks to attach additional pages if necessary to get the message across. This is an example of one of the forms in the existing manual. It's the stakeholder support form. You can see that it is intending to have residents fill out what sort of concerns they have. And then there is a space at the bottom of the form for 11 households to sign, indicating that they are in support of sort of just the initial request to pursue a study inside a neighborhood. The fact that this form has 11 lines for signatures is the subject of another request that I'll get to in a moment. But first I'll talk about speed cushions, and Kathy mentioned speed cushions as well. The city does have a separate speed cushion program, and the speed cushion criteria, the independent criteria that are related expressly to speed cushions are not included in the STEP manual, even though the STEP manual does talk about speed cushions sort of generally. So our proposal would be to incorporate the speed cushion policy and all the criteria into the STEP manual. They're very, very similar processes, and I think it makes it much more intuitive for residents to understand speed cushions in the same context as other traffic calming devices that sort of, in many cases, serve the same function. A moment ago, I talked about initiating a request, and I showed you the form with space for 11 signatures. The actual STEP manual only requires support from 5 households plus the requester, which is a total of 6. So there's a little bit of a disconnect when there's 11 spots on the form, but the manual only requires 6 signatures in support. So we're proposing to maintain the requirement for 6 households to initiate a study, and the form would thus be modified to provide space for just those 6 households. This slide has a lot of numbers on it, and it's because it's a little bit complicated in terms of which streets qualify for the STEP program. And I will point out that there is no clear criteria in the existing STEP manual about which streets qualify. But in the city's speed cushion program, there are very clear criteria, and that's what we're attempting to show on the left side of the slide here. Speed cushions are eligible on residential, local, or collector streets with a speed limit less than or equal to 30 miles an hour, and where the 85th percentile speed is at least 6 miles an hour above the speed limit. The 85th percentile speed is the speed at which 85% of vehicles are traveling at or below. It's kind of a mouthful to try to understand that, but in general, the 85th percentile speed is usually a little bit higher than the average speed. Average speed on a street, you know, if the average speed were, say, 25, maybe the 85th percentile might be 28 or 29, depending on how fast those high-speed vehicles are going. And for speed cushions, there is a threshold that streets with at least 400 vehicles per day are eligible for speed cushions. So our proposal is to adopt those criteria in the STEP manual for all traffic calming devices. And the only change we propose is on collector streets, we propose to increase the traffic volume threshold from 400 vehicles per day to 1,000 vehicles per day. Almost all collector streets in the city have at least 1,000 vehicles per day, so it's not a major change in terms of what streets would be eligible. But I think it acknowledges that collectors are intended to carry a little bit higher volume than typical local streets. There are a couple of exceptions to the criteria. For speed cushions, city staff can waive those speed and volume thresholds that I showed on the previous slide for streets that have a demonstrated cut-through traffic problem. And, you know, cut-through traffic isn't defined per se, but I think it's one of those things that maybe you know it when you see it, when there's a lot of people that are clearly making turns into and out of a neighborhood without stopping inside the neighborhood just to avoid a traffic signal on the arterial system or to try to find a quicker way to get through to a freeway interchange. That's clearly a cut-through traffic problem. And we agree that it is appropriate that city staff should be able to apply the STEP program to streets with a cut-through traffic problem. You know, the thresholds for traffic volume apply to vehicles per day. There might be a cut-through traffic problem that only applies during an hour or two of the day. but it might be a very serious problem during those couple of hours. So we support the ability of city staff to waive those thresholds where they're needed to address a particular problem. We're also proposing to add one more exception, and that is to reduce the speed threshold by 2 miles per hour on streets with schools, parks, or those that are designated as bicycle boulevards. You remember from the previous slide that our speed threshold for speed cushions is that the 85th percentile speed needs to exceed the speed limit by 6 miles per hour or more. So for these streets with schools or parks or bicycle boulevards, we would drop that 6 down to 4 and say that the 85th percentile speed needs to be only 4 miles an hour greater than the posted speed. So let's talk a little about funding. The existing STEP manual envisions that city funding is used for traffic calming devices. And there isn't a lot of discussion in the manual about other types of funding sources. The manual does discuss the fact that sometimes large-scale devices have funding needs that are potentially greater than just accessible to the city in a particular year. And so they may need to compete for city funding, and it may take a while in order for a neighborhood to become eligible for funding for those devices. But in general, city funding is what's envisioned. In the speed cushion policy, there is some discussion about private funding in case a neighborhood wants to contribute its own funding some way other than funded by the city. And in those cases, speed thresholds can be circumvented. So if a street doesn't quite meet the speed threshold that is required to install a speed cushion, then if a community wants to contribute private funding, the community can go ahead and pursue a speed cushion even though the threshold is not met. It doesn't avoid the need for petitioning and consensus building, but it does avoid the speed threshold. We're proposing to retain city funding as a default funding mechanism and still allow the private funding for traffic calming as I mentioned. Tempe has a real unique way of judging neighborhood support for traffic calming. There are 3 tiers within each petitioning boundary. I mentioned a moment ago that 100% of residents adjacent to a device are required to approve. And we believe that is a smart policy. There are disadvantages with traffic calming devices for those who live immediately adjacent. And so it is important that those folks immediately adjacent are supportive of a device. The second tier is those folks whose primary street is affected by a traffic calming device. And the city's thresholds require 75% of the people in that second tier to support traffic calming. And the third tier is those residents whose access is affected, but it's not their primary street access. So they may live a couple blocks away or down the street where they have other ways in and out. And the STEP manual requires 51% support from that third tier. We are proposing to retain those 3 tiers, but drop the support requirement in the middle tier from 75% to 70%. That's to be consistent with the practices of a lot of other agencies that we surveyed that do use a 70% support level rather than 75%. It's a small change, but we think it is it moves in the direction of making petitioning a little more attainable. I think if there's anything we learned from COVID, it's that we can do a lot more online than we ever thought before. And the existing STEP manual, as you might expect for something from the 2008 timeframe, doesn't really talk about online petitioning. But we are proposing that upon request, if a neighborhood requests, the city would provide an online platform to help with signature gathering so that the community could, for instance, email links to their neighbors, and residents could sign the petition online rather than having a door-to-door petition gathering process. We are hoping that that sort of process could lead to a couple things. We are hoping that it would lead to a little bit more engagement with the community. Sometimes we have heard anecdotally that when a petitioner knocks on their neighbor's door, it might not be, there might really just not be enough time to explain the entire program, the entire traffic calming plan, and understand the pros and cons and all the ramifications. So by having some information available online, it would allow members of the community to just spend the time that they feel they need to feel very comfortable about the plan that's proposed. And furthermore, we are hoping that it would gain some more traction from people who might be reluctant to answer the door just for security or safety reasons. And certainly in the COVID era, we learned that you can't just take for granted that somebody's going to answer the door when you knock. So I think that's those are two important ideas that kind of come behind the online petitioning. However, we also heard from our stakeholders that there is nothing like the in-person interaction between neighbors, the community building that might occur when people are talking face-to-face about a particular traffic calming plan. So we certainly want to encourage that in-person petitioning to continue to occur and offer it as an option. And therefore, we are suggesting that online petitioning be available as an option only if the neighborhood thinks it would be helpful or necessary. I'm going to move on to city outreach. Under the existing STEP manual, residents are the ones who are responsible for signature gathering during the consensus building process. And the only exception is that for large scale projects, the city may mail postage paid ballots to those households in the third tier, the ones in the 51% support category that I mentioned earlier. In the proposed configuration, we would like to propose that if the neighborhood requests, the city would mail information to households in the petition boundary to let them know about the STEP program, about the traffic calming plan that has been proposed, and the mailing could also include a link to an online petition. We looked at a lot of different ways the city could reach out to households within a petition boundary, and we found that US mail is probably the best option for that outreach because the city has a database that allows it to generate mailing addresses exactly for those households that are within a petition boundary. So it targets exactly the parcels that are affected by the plan without involving anyone else. Another challenge is the issue of vacant parcels. And this was not addressed in the existing STEP manual. And we want to propose two changes related to vacant parcels. First, if there is a vacant lot in the petition area with no house, no habitable dwelling, we would propose that that lot not be included in the petition area. And so it would be subtracted. There's also a possibility that a home might be vacant. It is sometimes difficult to tell whether a home is vacant or whether a home is occupied by someone who is maybe has a different schedule than is typical of the rest of the community. And so we're reluctant to just subtract houses that where no one answers the door, where someone thinks they might be vacant, because in fact they might not be vacant. So for vacant homes, we are proposing that the owner of the home can speak for the parcel and either sign or choose not to sign the petition in support of the device. The step manual also didn't address whether renters or owners are authorized to sign a petition. And we're proposing to add a little more clarity to the document to make sure that it's clear. We propose that for single-family rental houses, either the owner or the renter is authorized to sign the petition. However, for multifamily rental parcels, we are proposing that either the owner or a manager, if for instance there's an apartment manager, that person may be authorized to sign the petition in support of all of the units that are affected. So if there's an apartment complex with 30 units, we would expect that residents may want to contact the manager, if there's an on-site manager, or talk with the owner of the apartment complex to obtain support from that parcel. However, we would also encourage that if the city mails information to the community, that it should include those renters as well, just so everyone is aware of what's being proposed. I think this is the last slide dealing with potential changes, and I think it's one of the most important. And it deals with how to handle non-responsive parcels. As I mentioned earlier, if there is a non-responsive parcel, that parcel is considered to be opposed to the traffic calming plan. We're proposing to set a framework in place so that we could turn that equation upside down. And in particular, if there is a non-responsive parcel who is critical to the success of the plan, the success of the petitioning for the plan, then we would propose that the city would send a certified letter to alert the owner about what's being proposed, and provide a certain time frame, maybe 30 days, for the owner to comment. If the owner responds, that's great. The owner either responds in favor or responds in opposition, and then the community can proceed accordingly. But if the owner does not respond, then the letter would indicate that the owner is considered to be in support of the plan. So it's kind of a way out of that logjam where sometimes there might be a whole bunch of rental properties, absentee owners in a neighborhood. Some of them may be out of state or even out of the country. It may be really difficult to reach those folks, and they may not understand the dynamics of a traffic issue in the neighborhood. So this proposal would be to just make sure that you give the owner enough opportunity to understand what's going on and comment. But if the owner chooses to remain disengaged, it allows the neighborhood to proceed with the plan that they're interested in. So I think with that, Kathy and Laura, that concludes my slides that go through kind of the major changes that we're proposing. So I think we're ready to open it up to any questions.
Thank you, Randy. Okay, is there anyone that is in the meeting that would like to speak or put in a question in the chat? I'm looking for hands. Okay, Linda. You are unmuted, Linda. Go ahead.
Thanks, Laura. I do have a couple of questions. The first one that I'd like to ask again, but first of all, I would like to comment, I think the title change of the STEP program is really good. I think that's a great new name and a lot easier for people to understand what it's all about. The question I have to start with is, if the data show that a safety risk is present, and there is 70% approval from neighbors affected on the street, why should the project be derailed because one person who lives adjacent to the device doesn't like it, just doesn't like it and votes no? I feel that's what's going to happen continuously if the tiered system is allowed to be used. where you have to have 100% approval from all properties adjacent to the device?
Yeah, that's a great question. If I might just give my thoughts on that, and I'll allow others to as well. I understand that it's frustrating, and I think the problem is that every traffic calming device has disadvantages, and those disadvantages are mostly accrued to the folks that live immediately adjacent. For instance, if it's a traffic circle, that means that parking may need to be prohibited in the immediate vicinity on all four legs. And so folks that are immediately adjacent to this traffic circle might lose their on-street parking. If it's a speed hump, maybe, I mean, I think one of the disadvantages of speed humps is that they create noise. And every time a vehicle goes up and down over the top of the speed hump, you think about a work truck with a ladder on the thing, and it's bouncing up and down, making noise 24 hours a day. Certainly speed humps have a lot of advantages, but the disadvantages are the ones that the folks immediately adjacent have to put up with. And so we don't think it's a good idea to force someone who is opposed to a traffic calming device. They bought their house in part because of its location and its accessibility, and we don't feel like it's appropriate to force a traffic calming device in front of someone's home or adjacent to someone's home who is opposed.
If I could just add one
Oh,
comment.
I'm sorry, Linda, go ahead.
Well, if I could just add one comment to that. I understand where sometimes things aren't going to be exactly what we want as far as outside of our home, but the good of the neighborhood is really dependent upon all of us agreeing that if there's a safety issue, if there's a true life safety issue or risk on a street, that should outweigh just the dissatisfaction of having to hear something driving by your house each day. And my second part of that is, what if a house that is adjacent to a mitigation device that's going to be put in, what if it sells and once it sells, it's torn down and 6 privately owned townhomes are put on that same lot? Does that property now get 6 votes? And if they do, and 5 approve, and one person says, I just don't like that, the whole plan is derailed?
Well, I think if there is a townhouse complex adjacent to a traffic calming device, you would really be looking at the parcels that are immediately adjacent to the device. So, depending on how the townhouse complex is configured, potentially all 6 are not going to be immediately adjacent to the device. There may be only 1 or 2 that are adjacent. And so it would be those that would be in that 100% tier. But I think the intention of the program is that every household gets a vote. So if there's 6 townhouses, that community would get 6 votes.
But those 6 would count into the second tier, not the first tier. Immediately, right. Yes. Okay.
Right.
The other thing I was going to say is that as we are presenting the petitions, it's a plan, right? So a plan can change and devices can be shifted sometimes in order to help get the consensus that we need. And an example of someone who didn't want it in front of their house, their comment was, yeah, it can slow people down, but they slow down before the speed hump and then they speed up after. And they were concerned about their kids because because of the way people drive over the speed cushion. So that's just one of the devices. Doesn't happen with all of them, but there are people who have other concerns that we need to listen to. So.
Okay, we have a kind of related question from Lauren that says, what if the resident adjacent to the device is the landlord? And what if that landlord pressures his tenant to side with them? This applies to the other tiers as well. There are areas of the city that are renter dominated.
Okay, I'm not 100% sure I understand the question. So I guess I'm assuming that we're talking about a rental property that's adjacent to a device, and the landlord is well,
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, we have active issues happening like this, I think, in Maple Ave. You know, you have landlords or interests there who really pressure people to side one way, or there may be an out-of-town landlord, someone who lives in California that could, you know, not respond in that situation or just say no, because the tendency is to just say no and not want any traffic changes. So it just seems like the whole issue of, you know, an out of town or a house that's not occupied, not owner occupied, presents challenges in that tiered system that we're proposing.
right. I mean, I guess I don't think the city can you know, deal with internal communication between the landlord and the tenant. But I think what we can do is, if it's a single family residence, you know, I think our proposal is to allow the tenant to be the one to sign, or to be the one approached to sign, if you know, if they're comfortable and they're in support. So,
But
I
don't you
agree.
say tenant or landlord? Don't you
Tenant
say?
or landlord, right?
Yeah,
If they're-
well, it just
if
seems
they're-
like the potential that the neighborhood's interest would be circumvented by an out-of-state or an out-of-town landlord who wants it a certain way, but it's not for the good of the whole, but they kind of obstruct the progress or the public safety measure that the dominant neighborhood wants. So
But
my,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Lauren.
no, go ahead.
If the residents are walking around, or some, you know, however the petition is decided to be done, and they ask that homeowner, maybe this is not correct, but I don't even know how the out-of-town landlord would know that the petition came to the house.
Oh, they know. I mean, you can look at the Maple. I mean, maybe Linda could speak to this issue because I think we have specific
Yeah,
examples.
I do know there was an example.
And often we will mail to those owners as well as the people that are residents.
But I thought in our process, we said we would mail to the owners. Randy, what was it during when there was no response, or that we?
That's right. I mean, I think maybe we're talking about two different things. Linda, I think maybe was talking about existing conditions, but because I think in the existing condition, it may be difficult to reach a tenant, and it may be necessary to mail something to an absentee owner. But in the new process, our proposal is to mail this certified letter that I was talking about to the absentee owner to sort of allow them to be considered in support if they don't respond instead of in opposition. But if a landlord is opposed, an absentee landlord comes out and says, yeah, I have looked at it. I've determined that I'm opposed to this project. I really am not sure that the city would like to, you know, push back and try to do something adjacent to that parcel. I think I'm not sure that's a good public policy.
No, I understand the complexity of it, but I also see there are neighborhoods that are now renter dominated. And so that in effect, you could have the out of town landlords deciding on traffic policies that impact the larger, you know, the residents who live there actually own houses and live there on a day-to-day basis. And it's complex, I agree, but it's problematic too.
It is, and I agree. I don't know that there's any perfect solution, but I do think that allowing the tenants of single-family homes to, you know, speak for the parcel can help with that. Can help to minimize the involvement of those absentee landlords.
Okay, we also had Phillip wanting to speak. Phillip, I'm unmuting you.
Hi, it's actually Phillip and Justine Yates. We're both attending the meeting together.
Okay, great. Thanks, Justine. Go ahead.
4 questions, actually. I hope that's okay. I'll start with, and Phillip has a couple as well. I'll start with my first question. Can you give me an example of what is considered a collector street?
Sure. The city publishes a map that shows what streets are classified different ways, but typically collector streets are like College, Hardy, Alameda. They're often the half-mile streets that are, halfway between two arterials that typically are designed to carry a little bit more traffic. They're usually straighter. They usually have traffic signals where they meet arterials, and they a lot of times they don't have front-facing houses. Sometimes they do, but they are typically intended to carry a little bit more traffic than local streets.
So for instance, in our neighborhood, First Street and Fifth Street would be probably considered collector streets. And okay, so that makes sense. And so you're raising the criteria from 400 to now 1,000 cars per day on that.
That's what we're proposing, but again, it's just a suggestion, and we're open to comments on it.
Gotcha.
And
yeah, and I will point out, the city does maintain a map of the traffic volumes on all its collector streets,
okay.
and almost every collector does meet that 1,000 vehicle per day threshold. So, I don't have the map in front of me, so I can't look at a particular street, but it's yeah.
Yeah. My next question, kind of pertaining to that same area, what type of streets are considered bicycle boulevards?
Well, a bicycle boulevard is, I guess the city has designated these bicycle boulevards as low stress, low volume, low speed streets that are intended as safe alternatives for cyclists to travel across the city. And typically bicycle boulevards are signed with, I believe the city uses a signing method that uses parts of the bicycle to designate different bicycle boulevards. So there's a route called handlebars, and there's a route called seat, and there's a route called, I don't remember all the names, but it's a specifically designated local street that typically traverses a fair distance. And sometimes there's some circuity involved. You might have to, make a jog left and jog right here and there to make your way through the bicycle boulevard. But the whole idea is to provide a good continuous route for cyclists on low speed streets that are often traffic calmed.
So it wouldn't be a street that just has a lot of bicycles on it. Like, for instance, our street, we have, I would say probably about 300 bicyclists per day, because we have a cut through to the Tempe Town Lake and the paths there.
Correct.
But I was reading with the bicycle boulevard, the criteria, it would be easier to get traffic calming, perhaps, if you were considered a bicycle boulevard.
Right. Well, we're proposing to drop that speed threshold by 2 miles per hour if it's a bicycle boulevard. And, there's a lot of different streets out. If there's anything I've learned in my 30 years as a traffic engineer, it's that there's a lot of streets out there and very, very different situations. And so I think the city, the city has the flexibility to be able to apply this program in a way that makes the most sense for individual communities. And if the city believes that your street has the same kinds of characteristics as a bicycle boulevard, and it would make sense to apply that reduction, and if they were asking me, which they certainly wouldn't have to, I would certainly support extending that 2 mile per hour reduction to a street with 300 bicycles per day.
Okay, that sounds good. One more question. New developments we have a lot of construction taking place within our community, and some of the developments are under construction, so there are not tenants yet. How would this apply to new developments that don't have any residents yet?
Yeah, that's a great question. And off the top of my head, I would say that if there is no resident and it is a vacant, uninhabited development, it probably can be excluded from the petition boundary.
Okay, very good.
But again, how far does construction have to be before it is far enough to be considered part of the petition boundary? I don't think the step manual is going to be able to provide that much detail. So it may be more of a judgment call on the part of the city.
So we would just apply a note to that specific parcel and say no tenant, vacant lot, or would the city actually come out and take a look and see that it was vacant?
Speak to that.
Well, you mean during your petitioning process? I
Yes.
guess I would ask the city, what their preference would be on that.
Okay. And when will this guide be? When do you expect it to be completed?
Well, we are excited to get our draft formalized probably within the next comment closes, as Laura mentioned, on July 12th. We would probably like to have a draft finished by the end of July, but I would want to let the city respond on, when we might be ready to officially adopt it.
Right. So right now, the plan is to get this draft report done. We have another set of presentations to the Transportation Commission and the Neighborhood Commissions. And then I believe we're scheduled for a work study session to council in October. So that would actually be the completion of the process.
Right.
And Philip has a couple of questions now.
Yes, hi.
Thank
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Randy, for hosting this. This is very, very important to our community, especially because as Justine mentioned, there are a lot of things that are under construction right now that are uninhabited, and we needed to clarify exactly what the guidelines are with regard to getting a signature. For instance, well, one of the properties that's on our street has been under construction for years and has changed its ownership 4 times, and now it's owned by a bank. And getting a petition from somebody such as a bank, for instance, I don't think that that's even going to be possible to do. But there are other houses that are there's nobody living there. So that could be challenging, I'm sure, to find out exactly what it is, what the requirements are to get somebody to sign there. Another question is, has the city considered holding developers accountable for some of the funding with regard to any kind of traffic calming whatsoever, whether it be speed bumps or whatever? And in any case, yeah, I think that's something that could definitely be addressed. I mean, I think that should be a standard for the city. Anybody that is developing anywhere in the city has to be held to those standards. They have to contribute to the surrounding areas, at least.
Yeah, two great questions, and let me start by talking about the home that's owned by the bank. And boy, I completely agree that is a challenging situation to have to deal with. You can't very well just knock on the door of your local bank branch and expect the teller to do anything about a petition for traffic calming. So that's really, really challenging. But we think that that's the kind of problem that might be helped by the certified letter part of the process, where the city may be able to send a certified letter to the bank, and it may take a while for that letter to get to the right person. But if in fact that person doesn't respond, we think that that's enough justification to be able to proceed with the plan. So I think there's maybe the potential to have some improvement on that. Remind me your second question, Phil.
Well, my second question was holding developers accountable.
Oh, right, developers. Yes, sorry.
Yes.
In my experience in other communities, it is common for developers to work with neighborhoods on traffic calming during the design of the development, during the sort of preliminary engineering phase of the development. And I know of many situations where developers have contributed to traffic calming and have assisted with consensus building and that sort of thing. So I think that's a common situation. I don't want to speak for the way Tempe works with developers, but I don't know whether Kathy, if you might want to speak to that, or if there's somebody else at the city that might.
Yeah, so I don't know if I'm the best one to speak to it, but I can give a start here. So there have been developers that have contributed to assist neighborhoods with potential traffic concerns because of a development going in. That has happened. As far as a formal process, there are laws and rules about. I think there has to be plans in place that can be pointed to, that can be contributed to. You can't. I believe that the city can't just say, okay, every developer has to contribute X amount for something that's maybe will happen in the future.
Hey,
I'm
Kathy.
sorry, go ahead.
This is Marilyn.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Hi. For you guys listening, I'm Marilyn DeRosa. I'm the director of the Engineering and Transportation Department, and I've been listening in. And Mr. Yates, you make a good point. We do collect development impact fees for expanded traffic infrastructure. Now, prior to collecting those fees, we need to identify what project we anticipate those fees going towards. We have not included in the past traffic mitigation infrastructure as part of that, but that's definitely something that you bring up a really good point, and that's definitely something when we renew our impact study, that's something we could include, and in that way, the impact fees, every developer throughout the city would provide some portion of the impact fee that they collect, that the city collects from that developer, would go towards our transportation infrastructure, including traffic calming. So that's a great idea, and that's something I'll take forward to our impact fee analysis.
Thank you for taking that seriously. That has become a serious problem for our area. We have all kinds of trucks and cement trucks and just anything that is involved with the development process, and they should be definitely held accountable for the street, not just the street calming, but also where they drive and get to wherever it is that needs to be developed. For instance, we have some stuff on Roosevelt that's been under construction for years. And then there's also some other stuff that's that's going to be on Farmer, and they're going to use they'll be using Roosevelt as a cut through, and that's definitely going to create problems. But yeah, thank you for looking into that for us.
We have Jonathan who'd like to speak, and we're kind of getting low on time. So if we could, let's let Jonathan go.
Thank you so much for allowing me to speak. I'll be as brief as I can on this Saturday morning. I'm sure you all have other things you would like to do. Firstly, I wanted to thank all of you for your hard work on this matter. I'm a pediatric surgeon. I live in Tempe. I work in Mesa. I have taken care of children who've been struck by cars or been in motor vehicle accidents, and have had to tell families that their child will not talk again, will not walk, will unfortunately pass away. So thank you for addressing this very important issue. Unfortunately, Mr. Dittburner, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I thought your idea of having non-responders be considered as those in favor of these changes, excellent. And I am in favor of the chicanes and traffic circles and speed bumps. But my concern is that it doesn't address the real issue, which unfortunately is the lack of a sense of the common good that Ms. Hollow alluded to. These are folks who feel entitled to drive any way they would like. These are folks who will race through chicanes, they'll plow over speed bumps and lifted trucks. So these measures aren't going to help. It also doesn't help in terms of those drivers that we all have seen who are weaving at 65 miles per hour on rural road. My biggest concern is that all of these measures will avoid the uncomfortable topic of enforcement. Of course, that's ultimately what is required to limit the poor behavior of these drivers. I would encourage in the traffic planning to think about enforcement. I understand that photo enforcement and other measures have been unpopular and folks fear re-election. But I do think the community at large now recognizes the need for these measures. And as somebody who has and does take care of these children who are struck by vehicles or are in cars that are T-boned by reckless drivers, I cannot emphasize enough to look at enforcement as an important adjunct, and also can't thank you enough for all of your hard work on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Ann Till, you are next. Go ahead, Ann.
Ann?
Ann, are you on mute?
I don't see it.
They can see more screens than we can.
Oh, okay.
Ann, we will come back to you. Okay, Frida, you will be next. Where did you go? Oh, looks like we've lost Frida. Ann, how about now? Are you with us? Okay, we'll come back to Ann. Linda, you had a follow-up question?
I do. I also have a comment. I really appreciate Marilyn DeRosa's comments about the possibilities of using some of the monies coming in from developments for mitigation. This is something our 3 neighborhood association mitigation committee has been asking for 2 years now. And I think it's an appropriate way to get some money in for the neighborhoods that are so grossly affected by the development of apartment complexes, all the high rises that are coming in within our neighborhoods. My last question is, the manual says that the requirements for a mitigation device can be overridden by staff if they determine that there is a cut-through problem. Are there specific metrics that they look at to decide if there's a cut-through problem? And if so, I feel that those metrics should be placed into that manual as well so that we all understand what those are.
Well, this is Randy. I guess I don't, as you said, there are no metrics in the manual. And if the city does use metrics, I do not know what they are. And so maybe the city might be able to address that question. But I guess what I will say is, I don't know that I would be in favor of putting too much detail in the manual with that in mind, because there are so many weird situations out there in the field. And you don't necessarily want to tie the hands of city staff if you say, well, you have to have 100 cars an hour in order to, be a candidate to have your thresholds waived, and you only have 96 cars per hour. Is that enough, or would you rather just have the city have the flexibility to look at a situation holistically and make that call? There's a trade-off here between putting too much information, too many too many criteria in the manual and taking away the flexibility from staff. But certainly that's a comment that we can take back and think about more with the city.
Yeah, and to be honest, I don't know that we've done it very often, but I know we have done basic license plate surveys where you check the license plate, the last 3 digits of people going into a neighborhood and then coming out within a certain amount of time. We've done it in a couple locations. This was past years, but we could certainly explore how to do that better if needed.
Thanks, Kathy. Anne, are you with us? You had a question? Not sure if we've lost Anne. And it looks like Frida has left us. Is there anyone else? Linda, I don't know if your hand's up from before.
I'll take it.
Okay. Anybody else? Oh, here's another question we had. Is a 30-day response time to a certified letter long?
Enter a message.
And they slow down the process?
Here.
Yeah, that's a good question. And, I don't know what the right time frame is there. And that may be something that needs to be fine-tuned. We kind of suggested 30 days as a starting point. I think what you want to make sure is that you give the letter enough time to bounce around a big corporate entity to find the place where it belongs. So, a week or two is probably not quite enough for that process to happen. And then, what also has to happen is the owner has to consider it and have time to take whatever action is necessary to respond. So, yeah, it is a long time, but I would be leery about making it too much shorter than that at the same time. However, I will also add that I think that's a great comment, and I think it's worth thinking about to make sure we get that number right.
Thanks, Randy. Anyone else? Further comments, questions? We are a little bit over our time limit, but we are certainly willing to take whatever questions anyone has. I'm not seeing any raised hands. One more time for Anne. Anne, are you there? Okay, I'm looking for, hang on, Anne has a question. She can't get her mic to work. Here's another one. Frida dropped in. I agree about the developer, especially Clark Park area in Roosevelt, where a new development will add 300 to 400 residents. Take care. Okay, here's Anne's. How are you addressing other issues like urban heat, ADA, etc.?
Well, those are both important issues, but neither of them are addressed by the STEP manual.
Okay, thank you, Randy. Anyone else? Scrolling through chat, let's see. Can we consider weighting the votes based on owner occupied versus absentee owner? So weighting the votes.
Yeah, that's a good comment. I saw that comment pop up in the Q&A a bit ago. And I think that's worth thinking about also. But by the same token, I think the main concern is when there is a parcel immediately adjacent to a device. And if we need that 100% support adjacent to a device, I don't think the weighting would provide any value. It might, however, in the second and third tiers. So it might be worth thinking about.
Thank you. Anne also says we have safety issues that are not just traffic speed.
Well, I would encourage Anne to contact the city and let the city recommend the right treatment that would be appropriate for that community. in addition to STEP, the city has lots of other resources at its disposal to help communities with all kinds of traffic issues.
Thanks, Randy. Do we have any further questions? Looks like Phil, you have another one? Phil, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, I had a question about when we are handing out ballots or petitions, rather. Sorry. I know that some of the residents are going to be mail-in or online petitions. In my view, I think that we should have everybody that is within the community, once it has been proposed that a change such as speed bumps, that everyone can be informed via a letter, so that they can be told exactly what they can do, or tell the city how they feel about any given street calming.
Phil, thanks. I tend to agree with that comment. I think there is a lot to be said for that unbiased information coming directly from the city, talking about, implications of a traffic calming device, both the good and the bad.
Anybody else? I'm not seeing hands. Okay, another one here. 70% approval from all neighbors on the street is a much more obtainable goal than a tiered system requiring 100%.
It does. And I think, I mentioned previously that I think the city is smart to retain that 100% threshold for the devices for the parcels immediately adjacent to a device. Because I think you need to make sure that the devices are installed next to people who are okay with them being there. And I know it's a challenge. I know it makes it more complicated, but I used to run the traffic calming program in Phoenix, and we unfortunately learned our lesson the hard way. When a device went in front of somebody's house and it caused on-street parking to be prohibited, and that person was livid. And it created a major problem that required the device to have to be removed. So I think, that the city doesn't want to get itself in a situation where they're having to go back and remove devices that have been petitioned for successfully through a neighborhood process, just because there's opposition from the folks that are immediately adjacent.
Thanks, Randy. Well, we are about 15 minutes over our anticipated time, and I want to thank everybody for coming out today. This was a great discussion, and we're hoping that you will also go online and put some remarks in the survey. Again, to get to the survey, it's tempe.gov/forum. There we will take everything that's said in that forum, and it will go straight to the city council for their consideration at some point, and to staff. Any last comments from anyone? Kathy, anybody want to wrap up?
No, I was just going to remind everybody about thank everybody for being here, and remind everyone about the survey, which you already did, and it's open until July 12th. And really appreciate all the comments we got this morning.
Thanks, Kathy.
And there is another meeting on Monday. We might want to.
Oh, yes.
The same meeting. So if you know people that couldn't make it today that want to attend on Monday, they can do that. And Laura, is it at noon?
Yes, it's at noon. Thanks for mentioning that, Kathy. I totally forgot.
Thanks,
Great.
everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your weekend.